Hello everyone, my name is Maria Villegas and I am the Communications Director I have the right to. To mark National Sexual Assault Awareness Month, we're launching the third season of our interview series with survivors and allies. The goal of this series is to serve as a resource for fellow survivors, offering connection, encouragement and insight for anybody navigating their own journey. The idea for these conversations came from a discussion that Jessie had with another board member. She shared that when she was younger, she wished that there had been a place for her so she could hear from other survivors, people who had walked a similar path and could offer hope. Through these conversations, we want to highlight the voices of survivors and allies who are helping create change by supporting one another, encouraging institutional courage, and building stronger communities that listen and stand with survivors. We're so grateful to share these stories, and we're excited for you to learn from the incredible individuals who are joining us this season. Today, we're honored to welcome Charlie Pillsbury. Charlie is a survivor and a dear friend of the Proud family. He's also Distinguished Practitioner in Residence in Dispute Resolution and the co-director of the Center on Dispute Resolution at Quinnipiac University School of Law. Charlie has dedicated his career to helping people navigate conflict, build an understanding, and create pathways towards accountability and change. Charlie, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
I would love to start our conversation by asking you to briefly introduce yourself and how you got involved with I Have the Right to.
Sure. Well, I guess currently I am as Maria said, referred to as a distinguished practitioner in residence in dispute resolution, which means I'm essentially an adjunct. I've taught both the Intro to Mediation course and currently teach an alternative dispute resolution course where we cover negotiation, mediation, and arbitration. How I connected with I Have a Right to really kind of came out of the blue. I happened to be during a summer vacation. I live in New Haven, Connecticut, and my wife and I often spend 2 or 3 weeks every summer on Martha's Vineyard off the coast of Massachusetts. And we were on our way now some years ago, and I always like to stop to pick up the Boston Globe to find out what's going on in the neighborhood, being an inveterate reader of newspapers. And I stumbled across this article about this young woman, a freshman at St. Paul's School, a school that I had attended myself. And it actually was more about the perpetrator, who was a senior, or sixth former, as we would call them. And in fact, I think also captain of the soccer team. So he was a big man on campus. And apparently not a tradition in my time because it was not co-ed, but now in these co-ed days at St. Paul's, apparently there was a practice of seniors on their week before they graduated scoring with freshmen, essentially raping them. And this is what this young man had done to Jessie Proud. And I was just flabbergasted. So I actually ended up writing a letter to the editor saying that I hope this young man is punished, but evoked this is something that actually also happened to me at St. Paul's School before there were men and women. It was just then, of course, it was young men assaulting other boys. I was young for my class and therefore an easy target, particularly when it's 2 against 1. It was really that experience and I think I ended up being asked to write an op-ed in the Hartford Courant about this. They'd obviously picked it up. And so I did. And the day after it was published, I get a phone call from Alex Prout, Jessie's father. And so I know what he's talking about. And I said, hearing from you, what prompted your call? And he said, you're the first person from the St. Paul's School community who has stood up for Jessie. Everybody else has been standing up for the perpetrator. No one has raised their voice to support Jessie. And so I just wanted to call you up and thank you and tell you that we're in the process of suing the school, and would like to know whether you would be available as a witness on Jessie's behalf. And I said, of course, I'd be glad to do that. So I did participate in a trial, but needless to say, that created a bond between the Prout family and me. What I also remember is that part of my job as director of the Center on Dispute Resolution at Quinnipiac law school was to organize a speaker series in partnership with the Yale Law School. And it's something that we've been doing now for 20 years. And I was talking to my colleague then at the Yale Law School, and he said, I read about you in the newspaper. And he obviously read this story. I don't know whether it was in the Globe or the Current, but he said, I think we should invite this young woman to come and if she's willing to talk, because at that point, I think there was a reporter from the Boston Globe who was writing a book about Chessie and her experience. And so I remember that we invited the journalist and Chessie to come, and that presentation was at the Yale Law School. Anyway, that's my story. And since then, like I say, we've kept in touch with the Proud family, and they've kept in touch with me. It's built a lasting friendship that goes beyond the sexual assaults that were experienced.
It's a beautiful answer. And I know that Chessie has always looked at you as a mentor and as probably one of the first people who stood by her. And so I remember that when I was listening to your story, the thing that really caught my attention was that after you experienced your assault, a long time passed. I imagine that it mustn't have been easy. And I wanted to ask you what helped you begin to recognize that breaking that silence was possible, led you to finally decide and write that op-ed.
Well, I think, really that Chessie's courage inspired me. Relationship with the St. Paul School, I remember I had one or two good friends, but I sometimes described the school in those days as kind of like Lord of the Flies. It was, young men can be very nasty in a boarding school setting. And, for the most part, I wasn't bothered because I was respected. I actually was the scholar athlete of my class, and I played, 3 varsity sports. But there were others in the class. I remember in particular that we had only one Jewish member of our class. He had a double strike against him because not only was he Jewish, but he was also a townie. He came from Concord, New Hampshire. So, even townies got grief. And so I remember I went back to my 10th reunion, and I felt somewhat uncomfortable. It was at that time that I started sharing some of that story with some of my classmates. But I then decided, I don't have to subject myself to this. I stopped going back to reunions until our 50th. And then I called up a friend of mine who I stepped in. I had a few friends that continued through those years, one of whom was a guy named Reed McDonald. I called up Reed and asked him whether he'd be at the reunion because I wanted to be sure there was at least a safe person, somebody I could talk to while I was there. And, it was a good experience. 50 years is a long time. Nice to see it, now we're grown men, careers much nicer than we were as students, so much more likable. And so I've now gone back to my 55th and my 60th reunion. And as a result, actually have reconnected with some of my classmates.
The idea of the school being Lord of the Flies is terrifying when you reflect on the environment that you grew up in. How would you describe it in terms of the archetypes of masculinity that you were taught? What are those messages you received as a young boy that then you had to carry and perhaps unlearn as you grew older? One
way I would describe it is that, first of all, I was spared. The St. Paul School in those days had 6 grades. We call them forms. First form was 7th grade, second form, 8th grade, third form, 9th grade. I started as a third former, as a freshman. And then my senior year, because I was on the student council and again, respected member of my class, I was asked to be a supervisor along with my roommate, and we were, in addition to a faculty member who kind of oversaw these dormitories, because the third, fourth, fifth, and sixth graders all lived in separate buildings, but the essentially the first and second, seventh and eighth graders lived in these dormitories, where they, like you were in ROTC in the Army. They just had all these cots and then, just canvas, between, so there was, very little privacy. Uh, and I'm sure, uh, there were things going on that we didn't see, but there were other things that, we were aware that, that there were times when, for punishment, kids would be told they had to go run naked and get a chalk, an eraser from a classroom in one of the classroom buildings. And I mean, it was so needless to say, when we were the supervisor in that dorm, it was a much different environment. And so it was a chance to kind of even then support these young kids who in previous days had often been harassed by it. So, like I say, a world-class education, you pay a price emotionally, but I'm a survivor, just as Jessie is. I'm glad to support her any way I can. And the work that she's doing now to support others who have been, I think, both not only at St. Paul's, but just at other schools and not just in high school, but also in middle schools, where this is happening in a lot of places.
I assume a lot of complicated feelings because from on one side you have, in your experience, great education, but also this horrible thing that happened and that shouldn't have happened, because every student should be able to receive education free from sexual assault. You mentioned how it was very important for you to have the support of your friend who accompanied you to the reunion. I have two questions, really. One is, what do you wish people knew about male sexual assault survivors? And second, when you think about the support that you received, what can we do in a better way?
Well, I think first, I think it makes sense to just tell my story, and it happens in my first year. I'm a newbie, a new boy, and as I mentioned, beginning in your third form or your ninth grade year, you lived in these houses which had names like Brewster. That was the house I lived in, and the houses often had, all third formers. Some houses had all fourth formers. Some houses had all fifth formers, and the sixth formers would go live in the what we call the upper school, where the dining room was. So made it very easy for the older kids to just roll out of bed and go to breakfast in about 2 minutes. But so I was, it was my first year. I was in Brewster, lived up on the third floor. Actually had a wonderful, friend. We used to joke around, but who lived next to me. So there were some nice people in that building. But at some point, in part because I think I was very young for my age. I started as a ninth grader, but my birthday's in October as a 13-year-old, rather than most of my students or classmates are either 14 or even 15, because some of them have stayed back a year. And I was very late coming to puberty, not at that point. And there was the joking around in showers after athletic games and people sort of snapping towels. That was fun. But one night I'm in my room. Often, you're supposed to have the lights out at 9 o'clock. Sometimes I'm doing my homework. Sometimes I had to do it under my bed with a light, so the master of the house couldn't see my light through the window. So one night, though, I think my lights are off. I've gone to bed, and suddenly these two form mates of mine who live down the hall come in the room, and they both pin me. Again, it was a code of silence. I wasn't really going to say anything. I just sucked it up. That's what happened to, So I think that when I went back to my 10th reunion, I do remember being worried about what it'd be to encounter these two classmates. It turned out, may he rest in peace, that one of them had died not long after, as a young man. But the other one was there, and you know, and some people brought their spouses. He had, so I'm a nice guy. I'm not going to confront him, 10 years later in front of his spouse, But it was awkward, and I just said hello and walked away. But that's why I didn't go back 40 more years. I didn't want to run into, and it was probably that, the again Chessie's courage that inspired me, and that not only support her, but also to reconnect with some of my classmates who are, decent people and have done amazing things in their lives.
Thank you so much, Charlie, for talking about this with us. I cannot imagine what it must have been like for a young boy to go through that experience and then not receive any sort of support from anybody until years later. And regardless of whether you were younger for your age or you were smaller, nobody should have had to do that to you. So thank you for sharing it with us and for sharing it with Jessie and Alex when you reached out to them. I think that it was just another example of the institutional betrayal that was going on at St. Paul's. The idea that you send your child to have a good education and then you put them in harm's way because the institution doesn't do anything to prevent this from happening. So I think that the second part of my question was, as a male survivor, many people feel that there is a lot of shame attached and that they have somehow lost part of their masculinity. How can you properly support a male survivor of sexual violence? How can you meet them once they have decided to disclose?
I think it's important for current survivors to connect with people who themselves are survivors. I think that's certainly true. And I know less about it, but certainly in domestic violence. But there is sexual assault, particularly in middle schools and high schools, and they need counselors. Yeah, there weren't any counselors in my day. Now most schools is mandatory. They have social workers, counselors, but I think it's that peer-to-peer connection that I think is important. For young people to have not just an adult they can talk to, but also young people. I mean, there weren't any in those days but I would think now that there's so much of it. I'm sure that's the way victims of sexual assault find support by talking with each other, and I'm sure that would be true of young men and young women. Finding ways to bring them together, not just have them to go talk to a social worker or a counselor, but really talk to their that peer counseling. In fact, that reminds me that my work as the executive director of this community mediation center grew an extensive peer mediation program that we developed. But the idea was to train high school students to be mediators and middle school students. Actually, we actually began working with the middle school first, 6th and 7th graders, and we would approach schools to see if they would be interested in. Now that we had kind of a model at this one magnet school, and so we developed that, and we found that the best peer mediators, and we told the principals and faculty as they select them, don't pick the brightest students. Pick the people who are kind of natural leaders. They might be captain of a football team. They might be, they might even be thought of as badass, have a bad attitude. But if they are interested, kids will work with kids that they respect. They're not going to work with mediators who are kind of goody two-shoes. They want those mediators to be their peers. And so, and there were other peer mediation programs in other community centers. I remember visiting one actually that not only had a peer mediation center, but they also did work in the juvenile courts. And so we did some of that too. And when we did that, we often paired an adult mediator with a youth mediator. My experience is that, even in middle school, you can train these kids to be mediators, and they are more effective at dealing with conflicts among their peers and supporting their peers than any adult is.
Absolutely. And that is precisely what I Have the Right to is doing. We provide education to all age groups, and we go to their schools, provide the workshops, the activities so that they can learn about consent, about healthy relationships, and put that into practice within their own communities. For example, you've spent much of your life in law, in education, in conflict resolution. How have you seen, or have you seen, the dialogue around justice and gender equality and consent evolve from your early years till now?
Well, we live in a different world. I mean, in that sense, that certainly what's right. My teaching's been here at Quinnipiac Law School, and I think what's interesting to see is that I think there are these days more women in law school than men. For the most part, in the both the mediation and dispute resolution courses I've taught, there tend to be women who gravitate to uh, um, particularly mediation as a modality. I mean, whether you're a man or a woman, you need to know how to negotiate. You're negotiating all the time. And arbitrators, um, they are generally experts in the area that they're arbitrating. And that's true. And I think in most law schools, the commitments that law schools have made to dispute resolution, solving matters outside of courts is, there are books written now about the banishing trials because so much of it gets settled through negotiation, mediation, or arbitrations. It's good to see, and I think I give a lot of credit to the U.S. for its development, both in community centers and law schools. Now I belong to an organization called Mediators Beyond Borders to basically train young people to deal with the disputes involving other young people, so they don't end up in jail or expelled from school or whatever it is that happens to kids who get into trouble.
That is very interesting because as an organization, we're trying to provide the same education so that prevention can happen, education at the peer level so that people are encouraged and have the knowledge to resolve any interpersonal conflict that they may have, because dispute resolution is based on the general pillars that we're trying to also teach our students, in the sense that you cannot have conflict resolution if you don't understand what a boundary is, if you don't understand what healthy communication is, if you don't understand what interpersonal communication is, if you don't respect the other person enough to sit down at the table and negotiate. And I think that so many of the conflicts that we see as an organization and interpersonal level could be avoided if each student has a real sense of respect and identity, and so can be said of so many of the other things that we have discussed. And I wanted to go back a bit into the aspirational masculinity side of our work. So as you probably know, one of our goals as an organization is to open the conversation to young men. And it is often very hard to do because so much of the conversation around consent and around sexual assault is very negative towards them. And so what we're trying to do is try to turn the table and give them something to aspire to. And so we wanted to ask you, what does aspirational masculinity mean to you as somebody who has dedicated his life to teaching younger people?
Well, I think what masculinity, but certainly, I mean, humanity, and the key in the work that I've done is you begin, even before you deal with any dispute, you begin by helping young men learn how to listen. Listening is a fundamental skill. We call it active listening. Now, when you're listening actively, you're not only trying to understand, the person's position, but what's going on underneath, and active listening involves not just the ears, but it also involves open-ended questions, not when you're, basically teaching young people how to talk with each other, how to listen to each other, and how to ask questions that are not blaming or finger pointing, but are curious. What happened? What was going on? What triggered that? Try to get. And I think that this culture, it's almost stereotypical, but women tend to be better listeners than men, and young women tend to be better listeners than young men. And Another thing that listening means is not interrupting. So wait till somebody finishes what they have to say. And men are terrible at interrupting. I'm still working on it. I think that you need to practice. You know, my wife is not shy to say, "You're interrupting, dear. Let me finish." And anyway, so uh, and I certainly, it helped me with my kids. I have to say, I learned to listen to my kids and modeled that. In some cases, it may be interesting to hear from these young men kind of what's going on at home. Where does this come from? What do they see their adults doing, their parents doing? I don't know. I'm not a family counselor. I'm not a parent teen counselor, but you're doing that kind of work. And young men and women need all the support they can get, and particularly in how they support each other, how they listen to each other, how they talk with each other, how they even talk with their parents but of course that's a whole nother, that's not your job.
No, but it is true that listening to the other person is a skill, and as any skill, it should be taught and it should be developed regardless of your gender. I think that is the basis of any healthy relationship, being able to listen to the other person. And you yourself said at the beginning of this interview how important it was for you to have somebody who listened to you after all of those years. Your friend that supported you as you went to the reunion. And I know that it was incredibly important for Chessie to have somebody who listened to her story and who came to support her. And so everything is based on the mutual respect that you give each other when you choose to sit down. And as we were saying, many survivors feel very isolated and uncertain. Many survivors feel that they are alone. And so knowing that there is somebody who will listen to them, we always say that during our presentations, having somebody that listens will change the trajectory of your life. So this is part of our Sexual Assault Awareness Month series. And we wanted to ask each one of our guests, first, what is your Sexual Assault Awareness Month message? What is something that you would like to share with a survivor, as a survivor yourself?
I'd say I'd want to listen to them. And whether you're yourself a victim of sexual assault, just listening to somebody's experience, people appreciate someone who listens.
Then the second question would be, what in the work of I Have the Right To gives you hope?
I think it's hopeful that someone like Chessie and have turned something that was just awful. Probably the worst thing that happened to her in her young life, and has turned that into something constructive that she's sharing with the world and helping others how to survive assaults, and also maybe even how to avoid those contexts in which you might be more easily victimized. I think that there's a lot of work to be done. I hope that there are more I Have a Right To's in other parts. So you can't cover all 50 states. And I hope you inspire others to do what you're doing.
And then lastly, I wanted to ask, when Chessie wrote her book, she sat down to write a list of I have the right to statements of rights. And so part of our organization's name is I have the right to, but it is also a question in this case. If you would have to finish the sentence, I have the right to, what statement would you say?
What comes to my mind is I have a right to be respected. I don't have a right to be liked, but I have a right to be respected. And I think everybody has that right. And certainly that's what underpins what the work you're doing. When you're assaulting somebody, you're not respecting them. So it's respect. So I have a right to be respected.
I really, really like that. Thank you so much, Charlie, for answering my questions. This has been a wonderful conversation. I told you at the beginning that when I listened to the episode that you guys recorded with Jesse, my biggest takeaway, other than the wonderful story that you guys shared, was I really want to hear more about Charlie's story. I really want to know more about him as a person, about the work that he has done. And you said something really beautiful 3 sentences ago, which was that you really admired the way that Jessie had taken something so painful and transformed it into something so positive, and she was helping other survivors. And I'd like to say that personally, that's what I think that you have also done. You took something that was incredibly painful that happened to you, and you became a teacher, and you became a lawyer, and you helped people walk through conflict. And that is an incredibly hard thing to do.
There's a wonderful passage from the book of Micah. Basically, it's love justice, do mercy, and walk humbly with your God. But I think of the work that I've done has been primarily a work of reconciliation. The emphasis is on mercy. But I think what's wonderful about I Have a Right To is that, it's you are doing justice as well as embracing mercy. That combination is very powerful. So whether you believe in God or not, you're walking humbly with my God.